Hi everyone, welcome back. It's time for another round of the BookTube prize. I got to judge part of the Octafinals, which ran from February to March, and now it's time for me to also participate in the semifinals. I was actually really looking forward to finding out if I was going to be asked to read for the semifinals, so when I got that email, I was really excited to see what group I was going to be given. I think that's a lot of the excitement, is just finding out what books you're being given to read. If you want to hear my thoughts on the Octafinals and how that went, I will link my sort of vlog wrap-up that I did. I sort of wrapped up books as I went, so I didn't really forget what I was feeling in that moment, and then kind of had final thoughts at the end where I did rank them. So I decided to do a very similar video for the semifinals. It just feels like the best way to share my thoughts. I'm starting this video off like I did the other one, where I'm gonna have a bit of an introduction and share my initial thoughts on the books, whether I'm excited to read them or whether I'm a little bit nervous. Because we're now in the semifinals, things are much more narrowed down. There's either Group A or Group B. I happen to get Group A, and these are the 6 books that I need to read for that. The first book in Group A is Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow, and I've actually already read this one. It was part of my Octafinals group, so I can share my feelings on this one already. I listened to it as an audiobook. I gave it 4 stars. I ranked it number 3 out of the 6 books that I had to read previously, so I enjoyed it. It was a strong contender, but obviously not a favorite of the ones that I had to read. Catch and Kill's full title is Lies, Spies, and the Conspiracy to Protect Predators. So this book is about people, specifically men, who use their positions of power and the money they have to silence people who are accusing them of wrongdoing, specifically sexual misconduct in this case. A lot of this book focuses on Harvey Weinstein, and it goes very deep, but we do also hear about a few other people, such as Matt Lauer. And I already had known a bit about the Harvey Weinstein story, so this really gave me a lot of background info. And then I learned some more information about other people whose names I'd maybe heard in a headline or two, but there hadn't been as much focus. Catch and Kill is the most popular book on this list in terms of ratings on Goodreads. It has 48,945 ratings, and it has an average of 4.49 stars, which is really high. The second book on this list is The Yellow House by Sarah M. Broom. This is one I have heard of, but didn't have any particular inkling to read it. From what I've seen, this one has much more mixed reviews on whether or not people liked it. There aren't a ton of people that I'm friends with on Goodreads who have read it, but those that have, the ratings are kind of all over the place. Somebody DNF'd it. There's been 3 stars, 4 stars, so we'll see how I feel about it. This one is a memoir focusing on 100 years of family history, specifically evolving around this yellow house that the author's mother bought in New Orleans in the 1960s. This book will look at things like place, class, race, and as they say here, the seeping rot of inequality, looking at what it's like living in New Orleans East, building your life there, growing up there, and then also this house that apparently has such a pull to the author, the daughter who moved away but then was drawn back to where she came from. I think this book is going to cover all of those types of things. This one has a lot less ratings at 7,955 with an average of 3.96, which isn't too bad. I'm a bit worried that I won't vibe with this one as much, but we'll see. The third book is actually one that I just recently got my hands on, and that is Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden Keefe. This is one that I had seen on BookTube a bit, and every time somebody talked about it, they were just raving about how great it was. This is exactly the type of nonfiction book that I like, because it does a deep dive on a very tumultuous time in history, being about the troubles in Northern Ireland. It focuses on members of the IRA, British soldiers, civilians who were building bombs, people who were being kidnapped. So this is going to be a very intense read, but I'm very excited to get to it. I'm really happy that I ended up getting this book in my group, because when I bought this, I did know that it was still in the BookTube prize in the running, so I was very happy to see it show up there because it gives me a reason to read it right away. This one has the second most amount of ratings of the 6 books that I need to read. This one has 32,247 ratings with an average of 4.43. So this is also another standout from this selection in terms of lots of reviews and still a very high overall rating. Fourth is Sea People, The Puzzle of Polynesia. This is by Christina Thompson. This is one I had never heard of before other than just seeing it on the BookTube prize list, and I'm pretty sure I didn't vote for it initially because if you were part of the judging pool, you could help narrow down the numbers because we had a huge list and we had to narrow it down to 48, I believe. So I had only just seen this briefly on the list, didn't have any particular interest to read it, but it's still in, so that's a good sign that it's a decent read. This one is looking at Polynesians and sort of the mystery of how were they able to colonize these far-flung islands? How did people without writing or metal tools conquer the largest ocean in the world? It's looking at this conundrum, so to say, that has puzzled people for generations. Christina is going to explore the stories of these people as well as look at the archaeologists, folklorists, biologists, and geographers who've puzzled over the history of Polynesia for over 300 years. This one only has 1,451 ratings, has 4.21, which is very strong, but not a ton of ratings compared to some of the other books. I'm curious about this one. I feel like I could go either way. I don't typically read nonfiction like this, but I'm obviously curious to see if I do like it. The fifth book is Solitary by Albert Woodfox. This was longlisted for the National Book Award in nonfiction. This is the life story of a man who served more than 4 decades in solitary confinement. He was already in prison for a different crime, and then there was a guard at the prison that was killed, and he, along with at least another man, were blamed for the death of this guard, and so he was moved into solitary confinement and spent so much of his life in there, and sort of the corruption in the justice system and what that does to people. It says here in the description that he was very aware of the fact that this anger and bitterness of what he had gone through could really destroy him from the inside out. So he and 2 other Black Panther members turned that anger into activism and resistance, and they became known as the Angola Three. So that's a thing that I have heard about a little bit. This is another nonfiction book that I would potentially pick up on my own. This one has 1,313 ratings with an average of 4.4. I'm probably the next most interested in reading this one after Say Nothing. I'd say Solitary is the next one I'm looking forward to the most. The final book is Underland by Robert Macfarlane. He is a British nature writer, and I love the cover of this book. It's awesome, very striking. I'm a little worried that I'm not going to like the book as much as I like the cover. Robert being a nature writer, this focuses on Earth, but what's below our feet, and looking at the dizzying expanse of geological time, as it says here. So looking at the birth of the universe to a post-human future, prehistoric art, Norwegian caves, Greenland ice caps, Bronze Age funeral chambers, the catacombs of Paris, things that are underground or kind of within the earth. Also talking, even about nuclear waste and how that's stored in the ground, things like that. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, I'm starting to like this a little bit more. This has more potential than I thought. It looks like interspersed with his thoughts are going to be stories from people who, as it says here, descend into the Underland, like explorers, artists, cavers, divers, mourners, dreamers, and murderers. So there's going to be a lot of stuff going on in this book. This one is almost 500 pages. This is the longest one that I have to read. So hopefully those stories will draw me in. I'm a little afraid that some of these musings about like myth, memory, and land might be a little too, I don't know, like dreamy for me. I don't even know how to explain that. The writing, it can just be like too much. It's going to go over my head sort of, and I'm not going to want to read it. I'm a little worried about that. But the other stuff about the, like looking at the catacombs and things under the earth and telling the stories of the people, that's something that would appeal to me a bit more. This one has 4,777 ratings with an average of 4.25, which is good. Those are the 6 books that I need to read for Group A, 5 of which I actually need to get to in the next 2 months. If you're watching this because you're just curious about my thoughts on a particular book, I will put the timestamps in the down bar below. Catch and Kill obviously won't be included in this one. You'll have to go back to my old video if you want to hear my full thoughts on it, but I will obviously mention it in the wrap-up when I'm comparing it to everything else that I had to read for this group. Hopefully you'll stick around, and I'll see you guys very shortly with my first review. Last night, right before bed, I finished Solitary by Albert Woodfox, and I could not stop thinking about this book when I was lying there trying to sleep, just going over everything that had happened in this. This has definitely gone up to the first spot for this round. I mean, I've only read one other book so far, but this is a very strong contender for the top spot. This is a memoir. The subtitle is Unbroken by 4 Decades in Solitary Confinement, My Story of Transformation and Hope. Albert grew up in New Orleans, and although he was surrounded by a pretty loving family, more or less, they didn't have a lot of money, and so he was, from a pretty young age, like running scams, stealing things in order to, feed his family, get money, and survive. And because of that, he did have run-ins with the police, sometimes because of things he'd done, sometimes because he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time and looked suspicious. And he ends up in prison a few different times, and while he's in there, he's introduced to the Black Panther Party. This is in the 1960s when the Black Panthers were on the rise. He's taught their way of life, their teachings, and he really loves this program, and he starts to believe and live by these rules. Eventually, he ends up in Angola prison, which is the Louisiana State Penitentiary. I believe it's the biggest prison in the United States. Notorious for, especially when he was there, for people being killed or hurt constantly, horrible conditions, and he experienced all of that. When he was there serving time for a different crime, he and a couple other men were blamed for the murder of a white prison guard, and it's very obvious that the reason he was blamed for it was because he was part of the Black Panther Party, and he was using those teachings to sort of rally everybody together. Angola at the time was segregated, so he was with all of the black prisoners, and he was sharing what he had learned from the Black Panther Party and trying to use that to better their living conditions. So because of that, they put him in what he refers to as CCR, solitary confinement. And he ends up spending over 40 years living like that. There was a brief stint of time where he spent 3 years in the general population. In between that, he spent 44 years living 23 hours a day, sometimes more, in a cell. The amount of racism that he experienced from the prison guards, the warden, and the state of Louisiana every single time he tried to prove his innocence was so frustrating. I read the first maybe half of this book kind of slowly, and then the second half I had to keep reading because the amount of shit that he had to go through and deal with, it frustrated me so much, and I just wanted to finish his story to know how he managed to get out, because he is a free man now. But oh my god, it is incredibly frustrating. It's also very sad because he talks about all of the conditions that he experienced and the other prisoners experience, and some still experience today. Prison reform is a thing that needs to happen in the United States, and this book really reiterated that for me. I knew a little bit about the subject, and I knew a little bit about the Black Panther Party, but really not a lot, so I learned a ton more about that in here. His ability to survive through all of that, keep a level head most of the time, really comes down to his belief in what the Black Panther Party taught him, and it's very impressive. Like, I can't ever imagine going through that and coming out the other side and still having my sanity. I also almost cried at least twice, which doesn't really happen to me very often. I really think this is a 5-star book because it moved me so much. It taught me a lot, which I also really love with nonfiction books, and it motivated me as well to keep fighting for things I believe in. Reading it while the Black Lives Matter movement has had a resurgence and everything that's going on with that, it certainly added to my experience with this. I would have enjoyed this book no matter when I read it, but reading this with the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the protests that are happening and the push that a lot of members of society and pressure that they're putting on police departments and people in power, it's so great to have that happening while reading this, because he ends the book talking about everything that we need to do to change and make this world a better place, and I found it very inspirational what he had to say. As of right now, I am currently about 25% of the way through Sea People. I've been listening to that on audiobook, and I just got Underland from the library, so I am gonna start that next. I'll see you when I finish my next book. I finished listening to the audiobook Sea People, The Puzzle of Polynesia by Christina Thompson, and this is a very in-depth look at trying to figure out where the people of Polynesia originally came from and how they were able to travel such long distances to colonize those islands, and when that might have been, which is very hard to do when Polynesian culture didn't have a written language. The book follows a timeline that starts around the mid-1500s, which is when the first European explorers found the area and discovered that there were people living there, and it continues all the way up until present day in 2018. It covers a wide range of topics, not only the history of these people as much as we can know from stories and family genealogy and archaeology, but also talks about the islands and the physical geography, the flora and fauna, how they would have traveled between islands with canoes, how much they actually knew of the area. I do think this book does a good job of respecting Polynesian culture and teaching you a lot about it, and then also acknowledging the harsh realities of some of the stuff that did happen to them, certain populations being almost wiped out, like decimated from diseases that Europeans brought over, and then also sharing their way of life. Those parts I liked. I also liked when it talked about the extremes in terms of there's this huge ocean in which all the land masses in the world could fit into. The author talks about an area that extends from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island. It's sort of this huge triangle in which the majority of Polynesia falls into, and how they may have gotten around, whether some of it was purposeful travel or maybe even just accidental drifting when they missed their mark. I think anytime it related to the people and what they went through, that was the part that kept me interested. However, there were also parts in the book that talked about the flora and fauna, the geography of the island, and like the geography, like the physical geography, just throwing out all these terms that I did not follow, and I could just feel myself just glazing over. If I had been reading the book, I would have just glazed over those parts, like didn't take anything in. Listening to it, I'd realize 3-4 minutes later that I hadn't absorbed anything that was happening, and I didn't really care because it was just describing things in this detail that I didn't want to know. There may be some people that like nonfiction books like that focus on the physical sciences, the really nitty-gritty of that side of it, but I prefer the parts that focused on the people and like the archaeological and sociological aspects of it. Because this book did have a lot of parts that were talking about physical geography, flora and fauna, or just went on too long, I feel like this is a 3-star book for me. It's not badly written at all, and there are interesting parts in it, but especially when compared to the other 2 books that I've already read, it just is nowhere near as interesting to me. So this is also going to be falling into the 3rd spot so far. As of right now, I am currently 25% through Underland, and I just got the audiobook for The Yellow House, so those will be the next 2 books that I'm continuing to tackle. So it sounds like I'm going to end with Say Nothing, which is great. Hopefully that'll be a really good book to end on. I'm a little sad that Sea People didn't end up being as good as I was hoping, but Underland is going better than I thought it would, so that's good. I have now finished Underland, and I'm happy to say that this one was actually better than I thought it was going to be. There was not too many moments of like deep, dreamy writing. There was a little bit in there, but I'd say the majority of it was very rooted in reality and what the author was doing or what other people were explaining to him. This one was split up into 3 sections. The first section was looking at places or things in England, and then he sort of went to mainland Europe, and then he went up north to like Finland and Norway. And he just explored different aspects of things that are in the earth. He went into a mine, he went into like a Bronze Age burial site, he went to the catacombs, and he also went into glaciers. So that stuff was very cool, and I liked the context that he presented everything in. I think my favorite sections, well, there was one thing that was really cool to learn about, and that was the wood wide web, which is basically the fact that trees actually help each other out using their roots. There's this fungi that's in the roots, and it actually creates a support system. And so even if the trees are different types of trees, like it could be a maple tree and a birch tree or something, for example, they can actually help each other flourish in the environment that they exist in. And I thought that was a really nice little thing to put in a book, and I didn't know it was a thing. So that was kind of cool to learn about. I think my favorite section was when the book talked about cave diving, because that is something that is so scary and so cool to me. Like, not only are you going to be exploring a cave, which on its own can be pretty intimidating and very dangerous, but we're going to do it while we're diving in water when you can't breathe. I mean, it's no surprise that a lot of people that do cave dive, they have stories and they have friends that have lost their lives doing it. But hearing about it, when the author was talking through, sharing some stories, not his own, but other people's stories, it was just like, ooh, it was creepy, but it's so, so cool. The author went to all of these places, and he wasn't super knowledgeable on everything, so he had people with him most of the time that were telling him more about the area, what was going on there, how it related to his entire story. And one thing that's sort of a side note of the book that isn't the main focus of it by any means is that whenever he was introducing these people to us and describing them and sort of laying out how they were qualified to be teaching us these things, he was always really nice in his descriptions of them. Like, he had really wonderful things to say about them, and for some reason that it just like struck a really positive chord with me. It was so nice to have him just say these lovely things about these people. Things like how capable they were, how kind they were, how much knowledge they had, certain abilities that they had. It was just, I don't know, it was a really nice little extra bit on the book. Also, as another side note, I read the majority of this book, but I listened to the last like 2 hours on audiobook, and the audiobook's actually really good. Like, I would not have minded listening to the entire thing on audiobook. The narrator has a really nice voice, and I thought he did a good job of telling the story, especially going from reading it on the page and then listening to it. I liked the inflection that he put into it. For this one, I'm gonna give it 4 stars. It's a really solid read. I think it's got a little bit in there for everybody. I got my sort of exciting, scary stories. There's also a lot about nature, and then there's writing about like interacting with the people. And because of all of these different things that he explored, and they varied so much with things that were very human-centered and things that were very like nature, science-centered, there's a good range in there. So I think pretty much any nonfiction reader is gonna find something in there that they like. As far as what I have left, I am a good chunk of the way through The Yellow House, maybe like 30%, and then I am just about to start Say Nothing, which is actually right there on my bedside table. I'm really excited to read that one, as you know. I'll see you guys shortly. It's me again. I've now finished The Yellow House by Sarah M. Broom, and this is a memoir. And I think my expectation when I picked up this book was that it was going to spend all of its time focusing on the Yellow House, which is the house that Sarah grew up in, that her mother purchased in New Orleans East in the early 1960s, and then also just talking about her family and how that related to, you know, different things like race and class and whatnot. And although the book did focus on those things, it also branched out into different directions that I felt took away from the story. I'd say slightly more than half of the book was focused on the Yellow House and also her family history. She goes way back. She talks about her grandmother, Lolo, and then also talks about her mother, Ivory May, her mother's brother and sister, so Sarah's aunt and uncle, and then also the fact that Sarah is one of 12 children. So there's a lot of people around, a lot of stories to tell, and Sarah's also the youngest. So a lot of these things happened before she was even born. She does talk a lot about what it's like growing up in New Orleans East and the different schools that she went to, the poverty that she saw and experienced herself. This house that her mother had these amazing dreams for was nice at first, but eventually it sort of became like the 13th child, and it would fall into disrepair. People would say they would fix something, they wouldn't fix it right, or things would just never get finished. And although the house may have been basically falling apart at the end, it's still the house that Sarah grew up in, and so there's obviously that connection there still. That first half or so builds up to Katrina. Sarah was not in New Orleans when Katrina hit. She was in New York City, but she does speak with some of her siblings that were there and gets a first-person account of what they went through right before it happened, while it was happening, and afterwards. And I found that part incredibly interesting. I feel like I haven't actually read many first-person accounts of what people went through in Katrina, at least not in book form, maybe in articles, but not like this. And I found that part very engaging and sort of the commentary on what that meant. Then after that, to have this story sort of shift and follow Sarah as she goes and works and lives in Burundi, and then returns to New Orleans and talks about working for the city of New Orleans and different things that, although they were interesting to hear about, I felt like the connection back to the Yellow House and her family was much weaker. And I felt like those stories should have been taken out and put into a different book. I would not have minded if she had spent more time telling family stories and built up to have the second to last chapter or towards the end of the book be about Katrina, and then have maybe 1 or 2 chapters on reflection, where they are now, what has happened since then. I think that would have been better for me. Like, the flow would have felt better. It would have made more sense because the title of the book is The Yellow House. And those connections that she was trying to make with those latter parts of the book, it just didn't feel as strong. Because I was still engaged and interested in almost everything that Sarah was talking about, even if I found the connection to be weaker, I would certainly read things that she writes in the future. She is an excellent writer. If you were looking to pick up this book, I would still say do it, because there are many interesting things that you get to learn about and hear about. Just know that at least I found the second half, or slightly less than the second half of the book, to be a bit weaker. This is another one that I listened to on audio, and I also want to mention that the narrator of this one was fantastic. Her name is Bonnie Turpin, and she does the voices for her siblings, particularly the voices that she did for her brothers were just really top notch. I love the way that she gave life to all of these people, especially because they are real individuals. So if you are considering listening to this book on audio, or that's something that you like to do in general, this is definitely one that you could experience that way. That concludes my thoughts on the second to last book. So the next time you see me, I will be sharing my thoughts on Say Nothing and wrapping this entire thing up. All right, time to wrap this baby up. I've now finished the last book that I needed to read, which was Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden Keefe. Patrick did not grow up in Northern Ireland, but he has Irish ancestry, and he grew up in Boston, which has a very large amount of Irish Americans. So when he was younger and going to the pub with his father, he was aware of people gathering money for the IRA and sort of distantly aware of what was happening. And then when he grew up and became a journalist, he eventually became interested in the Troubles and what that all meant. He actually wrote a book that I read way back in the day. It had to have been one of the first audiobooks that I ever listened to because I remember it being super fascinating. Like, I have a memory of listening to that book and where I was. He wrote Chatter, Dispatches from the Secret World of Global Eavesdropping, and I remember loving that book. So when I actually picked this up and opened it up and saw that he was the author of that book as well as this one, I was like, whoa, this is a good sign because of how much I liked Chatter when I first read it, like 14 years ago or something. It was a long time ago. But anyway, that just raised my expectations for this book. I think it would have been really hard for this book to live up to my expectations, and I think it almost did. Before I read this book, I'd say that I could sum up everything I really knew about the Troubles in maybe 4 or 5 sentences, and now I could write like a huge paper on it from everything that I've learned in this book. The author says that himself, that this is a narrative nonfiction. It's not a history book, so he does focus more on the IRA, which is, if you don't know, that's the side of the struggle that wanted to break away from Britain and wanted Ireland to become a united Ireland. The other side would have been the Loyalists, the people who wanted to stay with Britain. The IRA is the one that people hear about more, and so this book focused more on their perspective and the players in that side of the game, and mentioned players on the other side, but definitely delved in, had interviews with, and focused on the big players from the Irish Republican Army. I don't think I ever really heard or learned about the Troubles in school. If it was something that was mentioned, it would have just been in passing. So I was very grateful that he took the time to explain, like, this is the people on this side, this is why they're on this side, here's the opposite side, and here's kind of the muddledness of how it got so bad, because this struggle for a united Ireland has been going on for a very long time. The entire idea of the title of this book, Say Nothing, makes so much sense because people knew a lot, or they saw a lot, and they wouldn't say anything because they knew it would get back to someone and it would get them in trouble, and they could either be threatened or killed. I think the one thing about this book is that makes it so intense is that this is very recent, and a lot of it you can't even really call it history because there are still tensions that exist there. I know that with the discussion with Brexit and the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and how there was discussions about what to do about that, because creating a physical border there could be a real problem. This book has a ton of notes and references, like bibliography index at the back, so it's very well researched. And if you are looking for something that really broadens your understanding specifically from the side of the IRA and everything that went on, this would be a very good book for you. I do kind of want to read something that is more of a history text or provides the point of view of the Loyalists and what the Loyalists did, because they weren't perfect either. And that sort of back and forth retaliation, we got a lot of it from the point of view of how the IRA saw it, but not necessarily how the other side saw it or what the other side was doing that wasn't so great. So I would like to read more from that just to have a better understanding of everything that took place. Now, how does that play in with my overall thoughts on all 6 books? Well, you're about to find out. I'm going to work backwards and start with my least favorite of these and work up to my favorite. That being said, I said this when I did the Octafinals, all of these books are good books. None of them were really painful to read or was I completely uninterested in. All of these had parts that I did enjoy, so none of them are that low in the ratings. I put Sea People at number 6. I feel like I don't need to get into why this is because I did already talk a lot about it, of course, but just the fact that there was a huge chunk of that book that I wasn't as interested in, and so I don't think it's going to get more than 3 stars from me, so that puts it at the bottom of this list. Number 5, I decided to do The Yellow House. Also, I feel like it's pretty evident in my thoughts on that one that the last third of the book, or slightly more than the last third, it just didn't fit as well, and so it was still more enjoyable to read than the Sea People because I was engaged in the stories she was telling us the entire time, but I just felt like it wasn't quite the right structure for the title of the book. It's sort of what you thought it was going to be. Number 4 I put as Underland. There were a lot of fascinating stories in here, and I definitely was never bored, but there were moments that were a little too like flowery and beautiful for me, but luckily it wasn't as much as I thought it was going to be, so it turned out to be better. But still not quite as good to reach the top 3. At number 3, in the same spot actually that I put it for the Octafinals, is Catch and Kill. The entire idea behind that story of Harvey Weinstein and Matt Lauer and other men using their positions of power and money to silence people is still so relevant, and just the amount of crap that Ronan Farrow got while he was writing that book, the fact that he was being followed and he actually made arrangements to have things hidden away and potentially released if something happened to him, like that's pretty crazy. Number 2, now it comes down to Solitary and Say Nothing in terms of who's gonna get that number 1 spot. Both of these books were very close, and they were very similar in sort of the reactions that I had to them. Very differently written. Solitary is first person, Albert's experience. Say Nothing is a third party with a lot of research rather than, you know, first person experience. It's a lot of research and interviews to give you that feeling of being first person. And both of them had a ton of information packed in, and there were a lot of names, places, and in order to tell the story for both, there was some jumping around in the timeline, which could be confusing for me as somebody who didn't experience it. All of those similarities bring them like very close together, but I think in the end, Say Nothing is number 2 and Solitary is number 1. I'd put Say Nothing at a 4.5 stars. Solitary though, that's a 5-star book. When everything with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement was really intense, I can't deny that that didn't influence my experience reading the book. If there was ever a time to read Solitary, that was it. And that may have been the thing that pushed it up to the top spot for me. Maybe if I read the book 10 years from now, I wouldn't have the same feeling and reaction to it. But a lot of times when we really enjoy a book like this, like a 5-star read, it's because we read it at the exact right time. That little extra bit of why it's number 1 is because of everything that was happening around me when I was reading it and how important it was that I was taking that in at that time. If you participated in the BookTube prize, and not necessarily the semifinals, but at any point, and you read one of these books, I would really like to hear what you thought of them and how you ranked it in comparison to others that you've read. If you happened to be in my group A, I'd love to hear from you. And you can certainly mention if you've uploaded a video, and I will go watch it to see what your thoughts were on all of them. And also, if you're just someone that has happened to have read one or more of these books, I also want to hear your opinion. As always, all of our links are in the down bar. You guys can go check those out if you feel so inclined. Thank you guys for sticking all the way to the end of this video, and I'll see you later.